Imagine waking up the morning after Christmas. The house is quiet. The kids are still asleep. There are leftover cookies on the counter, wrapping paper probably still scattered across the living room floor. It's that soft, slow morning where nothing is expected of you. You don't have anywhere to be. Now, imagine you walk downstairs, and there are pages sitting on your staircase. Pages that weren't there when you went to bed. That's what Patsy Ramsey found on the morning of December 26th, 1996. And the moment she started reading, her entire world collapsed. Before we get into what happened, I want to give you a sense of who the Ramseys were, because I think it matters. John Ramsey was a businessman. His tech company had grown fast, genuinely impressive by any measure. Patsy was warm, social, deeply involved in her community. They lived in a large, beautiful home in Boulder, Colorado. The kind of neighborhood with white Christmas lights on every house and kids riding bikes in the summer. Their son Burke was 9. Their daughter JonBenét was 6. And if you've heard of this case at all, you've probably seen her face. She competed in children's beauty pageants, and those photographs, her bright smile, the elaborate costumes, would end up on the front page of every newspaper in the country. But on Christmas Day, none of that mattered yet. Christmas Day was just Christmas, gifts, family friends over for dinner, laughter. At some point in the evening, the Ramseys went to a dinner party at a neighbor's house. By the time they drove home, JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car. John carried her upstairs without waking her. Burke stayed up a little while longer. Patsy got everyone settled, and then the house went quiet. The next time Patsy came downstairs, it was 5:52 in the morning, and those pages were on the steps. The note said JonBenét had been kidnapped. It demanded a ransom of $118,000. Now, that number, I need you to sit with that for a second, because it's one of the strangest details in this entire case. Not $1 million, not even $500,000, $118,000. An oddly specific, oddly small amount for a family people assumed was very wealthy. But here's the thing. That number was almost identical to a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. Think about what that means. Whoever wrote that note either knew John personally, had access to his financial information, or was someone inside that world. That detail alone has kept investigators and researchers spinning for nearly 30 years. The note also said, "Do not call the police." Patsy called the police. And I'm not saying that was the wrong call. Of course she called. But from that moment forward, the clock started on what would become one of the most compromised crime scenes in American criminal history. Here's where things start to go sideways. And I really want you to understand this part because it shapes everything that comes after. When officers arrived that morning, they were treating this as a kidnapping, a missing child. And that framing matters because kidnapping cases and homicide cases are handled completely differently. In a kidnapping, you're waiting. You're monitoring phones. You're trying to keep the family calm and ready. So the house stayed open. Friends came over. Neighbors came over. People made food. Clean surfaces moved through rooms. Nobody was thinking about trace evidence or chain of custody. Why would they? The working assumption was that JonBenét wasn't in the house. She'd been taken. Hours passed. The phone didn't ring. No kidnapper called to make contact. No follow-up instructions. Just silence. And as the morning stretched into the afternoon, this restless, heavy uncertainty settled over everyone inside that home. Then, around midday, a detective asked John Ramsey and a family friend to walk through the house, top to bottom, and look for anything unusual. John went down to the basement. He found a small room, sometimes described as a wine cellar. There was a latch on the door. He opened it, and the kidnapping investigation became a murder investigation in an instant. JonBenét had never left the house. She had been there the entire time. What John did next is one of those moments that's almost impossible to judge because the grief of it is just overwhelming. He picked her up. He carried her upstairs. A father holding his daughter. But from an investigative standpoint, that moment complicated everything. Moving the body meant disturbing the scene. Every point of contact added another layer of uncertainty. And that uncertainty stacked on top of hours of friends walking through the house, surfaces being touched, rooms being moved through. And suddenly investigators were left with a question that would haunt this case forever. What evidence was actually from the crime? And what was created after? That's not a small question. That's the question that has blocked every attempt to close this case for nearly 3 decades. And here's the part that genuinely gets me every time I think about it. Nobody was trying to hide anything in those first hours. There was no cover-up happening in that moment. People were scared and heartbroken and doing what humans do, reaching toward each other, trying to help. But in doing so, they may have obscured the very truth they all desperately needed. The ransom note, the body found inside the home, a crime scene that was never fully preserved. This case was already broken before it had really begun, and we're only at the beginning. Let's talk about what investigators actually found, because once forensic teams got into that house, really got into it, what they documented raised more questions than it answered. And some of those questions, even with everything we know today, still don't have clean answers. JonBenét had duct tape over her mouth. Her wrists were loosely bound, and around her neck, someone had fashioned a cord into a makeshift garrote, using part of a broken paintbrush. Patsy Ramsey's paintbrush, from her own art supplies, in her own home. The basement room where she was found showed no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scratching at the walls. It was quiet, enclosed, tucked behind a latched door that most visitors to that house probably didn't even know existed. And that detail, that quiet, hidden room, immediately split investigators into 2 camps that would never fully reconcile. The autopsy revealed 2 causes of death, a severe blow to the head and strangulation. The skull fracture alone was catastrophic. But which came first, and how much time passed between them? That might sound like a technical question. It isn't. It's everything. Because the sequence of those injuries tells you something about intent, about what was happening in that room, about whether this was planned or whether something went terribly wrong in the middle of something else. Medical experts disagreed. Some believed the head trauma came first, that JonBenét may have been unconscious or close to it before the strangulation occurred. Others weren't sure the timeline was that clean, and that disagreement never got resolved. It just became another unsteady plank in an already unstable foundation. Now, the note. I need to spend some real time here because the ransom note in this case is one of the most bizarre pieces of evidence I have ever come across in true crime. And I've been doing this for a while. It was 3 pages long. 3 pages. Most ransom notes, if you can even call them that, are a few lines. We have your daughter. Don't call the police. Leave the money here. Done. Fast. Because the whole point is to get in and get out. This note was over 300 words. It had dramatic language. It had movie references. It had detailed instructions. It read almost like someone had sat down and really crafted something. But here's what makes it genuinely strange. The paper came from inside the Ramsey house. The pen came from inside the Ramsey house. And investigators believe the author didn't just sit down and write it once. There's evidence of practice writing. A draft, or at least the beginning of one, was found inside the house as well. Sit with that for a second. Whoever wrote this note didn't rush in, scrawl something, grab the child, and run. According to the physical evidence, they apparently had enough time and enough comfort to locate writing materials in an unfamiliar home, try what they want to say, write more than 300 words, put the materials back, and leave the final note on the staircase. That is not the behavior of someone panicking. That is the behavior of someone who felt completely at ease in that house. Now, does that mean it was someone who lived there? Not necessarily. People who have studied this case for years will tell you that a determined, calculated intruder could theoretically have entered before the family returned for their Christmas dinner and spent hours inside that house waiting. The Ramsey home was large. It had multiple entry points. It had rooms that weren't regularly used, but theoretically and probably are very different things. And investigators kept coming back to the same uncomfortable reality. This note reads like it was written by someone who knew the family. Then there's the number, $118,000. We talked about this in part 1, but I want to go deeper because the more you look at it, the stranger it gets. That amount matched John Ramsey's recent bonus almost exactly. Not his general wealth, not a round estimate of what someone might think he was worth. His bonus, a specific figure from inside his financial life. Now, investigators were careful not to overstate this. That kind of information isn't always secret. Business records exist. Colleagues know things. People talk. An outsider with the right connections could potentially have accessed that number without being close to the family. But combined with everything else, the paper, the pen, the practice draft, the 3 pages, the hidden room, the ransom amount added to a picture that was becoming increasingly hard to explain away. Handwriting analysts were brought in, multiple experts from multiple agencies, all given the same task. Compare Patsy Ramsey's known handwriting to the note. And here's where this case does something it will keep doing over and over again. The evidence refused to close the door in either direction. Some experts said Patsy could not be eliminated as the author. Others said the similarities were inconclusive. Nobody could say with certainty that she wrote it, but nobody could confidently point to anyone else either. This is the part that I think gets lost when people talk about forensic science. We've grown up watching TV shows where the lab results come back and everything clicks into place. In reality, especially in a case this complicated, this compromised from the start, evidence doesn't always do that. Handwriting analysis is interpretive. DNA degrades. Fibers transfer innocently. Memory shifts. And when you're building a case out of dozens of smaller pieces that all point in slightly different directions, you don't always get a clean answer. You get a probability, a leaning, a most likely. This case gave investigators almost none of that. Meanwhile, outside the house, the media had completely taken over. Those pageant photos of JonBenét were everywhere. Every network, every newspaper, every evening broadcast. And I want to be careful here because I think there's something worth saying about that. The people who actually knew JonBenét, her teachers, her friends, family members, they described a completely different child than the one being broadcast into living rooms across America. Energetic, funny, affectionate. A kid who loved school and goofed around and was just a little girl. But the public never really got to see that version of her. What they got were the pageant photographs. And that framing quietly shaped how millions of people perceived not just JonBenét, but her parents and the case itself. That's worth remembering. Back inside the investigation, the Boulder Police Department was starting to crack under pressure. Why wasn't every room searched immediately? Why were civilians allowed to move freely through the house for hours? Why was John Ramsey, the father of the victim, the one who found the body after being asked by a detective to search the home himself? These weren't questions being raised years later by armchair detectives. They were being asked during the investigation. And the answers, that officers believed they were responding to a kidnapping, not a homicide. That circumstances were evolving rapidly, that decisions made sense in the moment. Those answers were true. But they were also deeply unsatisfying. Because here's the thing nobody could escape. Those first hours couldn't be undone. And then, just when you think the picture couldn't get any more complicated, the DNA, during forensic examination of JonBenét's clothing, analysts found something that nobody in the Ramsey family could account for. Unidentified male DNA. Not from John. Not from Burke. Not from any family member or friend or investigator who had been in that house. Someone else's biological material on a 6-year-old girl's clothing on the night she was murdered. For people who had already concluded that this was an inside job, the DNA was explainable contamination, manufacturing transfer, something innocent that had nothing to do with the crime. For people who had always believed an intruder was responsible, it was the closest thing to proof they had ever seen. But here's the brutal truth. Advances in DNA technology, rather than solving this case, made it more complicated. Because the question was no longer just who. It was, what does this DNA actually mean? Does it belong to the person who killed her? Does it represent some random transfer that happened before that night and has nothing to do with the crime at all? Or is there a third explanation nobody has fully accounted for? Nearly 30 years later, that question still doesn't have a definitive answer. And that, right there, is why this case still haunts people. It's not that there's no evidence. There's actually quite a lot of it. It's that every single piece of it can be read two ways. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in this case. By the time investigators started really digging, really sitting down with the people who knew JonBenét, reconstructing the timeline, going through every ordinary detail of her last 24 hours, the relationship between the Ramsey family and law enforcement had already started to fracture. And once that happened, it never fully healed. John and Patsy agreed to some early interviews. But pretty quickly, attorneys got involved. Interview schedules got negotiated. Formal questioning got delayed. Now, I want to be fair here because I think this is a moment where it's easy to jump to conclusions, and I don't want to do that. From the investigator's side, delayed questioning in a homicide case is a serious problem. Those first conversations matter. Memory is freshest. Details that feel insignificant in the moment can turn out to be everything. Every hour that passes before a formal interview is an hour where recollections blur, where stories get compared, where the raw, unfiltered version of events starts to get smoothed over. Not necessarily intentionally, just because that's what human memory does. From the Ramseys' side, they believed, and there's real evidence to support this, that investigators had already decided they were guilty, that they weren't being treated as parents who had just lost their daughter. They were being treated as suspects. And if you genuinely believe the people investigating your child's murder think you did it, hiring lawyers and slowing things down starts to feel less like obstruction and more like survival. Both of those things can be true at the same time. But the result was a wall. And walls in murder investigations have a way of becoming permanent. Outside the house, something else was happening that would shape this case just as much as anything happening inside it. The media had fully arrived. And I mean fully. This was 1997. 24-hour cable news was still relatively new, and the JonBenét Ramsey case became one of the first true crime stories to play out in real time on television. Night after night, commentators who had never set foot in Boulder, former detectives, psychologists, handwriting experts, attorneys, sat across from each other and delivered confident, contradictory opinions to millions of viewers. Diagrams of the Ramsey house appeared in newspapers. Experts debated the ransom note line by line. People who knew nothing about the physical evidence were explaining what the physical evidence meant. And the public started picking sides. Some people became absolutely certain it was someone inside that house. Others became just as certain that investigators had fixated on the family so early that a real killer had simply walked away while everyone looked in the wrong direction. What's remarkable, and what I think is actually the most interesting thing about this case, is that both groups were often looking at the exact same facts. Take the basement window. Investigators discovered that a window in the lower level of the Ramsey home had been broken. John Ramsey himself confirmed it. He'd broken it months earlier when he locked himself out of the house. For the intruder theory, that window is everything. A point of entry. Proof that someone could have gotten in without a key, without being seen, without leaving obvious signs of a break-in. For the other side, the area around that window, the dust, the cobwebs, the undisturbed sill, suggested it hadn't been recently used the way an intruder would have needed to use it. Same window, same evidence. Completely opposite conclusions. That's this case in a nutshell. Let's go back to the note, because there's a layer to it we haven't fully explored yet. Behavioral analysts who studied the ransom note started noticing something strange about the language. Parts of it didn't sound like a real criminal demand. They sounded like movie dialogue, phrases that echoed Dirty Harry, references that felt lifted from ransom, from Speed. The kind of dramatic, stylized language you'd find in an 80s or 90s action thriller, not in an actual ransom note from an actual kidnapper. The note identified the author as representing a small foreign faction. No political message followed. No organization ever came forward. No one ever called to collect the money. And that last part, that's the detail that keeps coming back to me. Because whatever else you believe about this case, the person who wrote that note never tried to get paid. The entire stated purpose of a ransom note is to get ransom. And it never happened. Some investigators read that as proof of staging, that the note was never meant to actually facilitate a kidnapping. It was written to create confusion and redirect suspicion. Others argued that the crime itself may have gone sideways, that whatever was originally planned didn't unfold the way the person responsible expected, and collecting money became impossible once JonBenét was dead. I'll let you sit with both of those explanations. Then came the fiber evidence. Fibers consistent with clothing Patsy Ramsey was wearing that morning turned up in areas connected to the crime. And look, I'll be honest with you. When I first read that, my brain went somewhere. I think most people's does. But here's what the defense experts said, and it's worth actually thinking through. In a family home, during the holidays, with laundry being done and gifts being wrapped in blankets being moved around, and everyone sharing the same spaces, fibers transfer constantly. Between people, between rooms, between surfaces. Patsy's fibers being in that house, in those spaces, is almost impossible to be surprised by. Was it significant? Maybe. Was it proof of anything? Not on its own. That's the answer you keep getting in this case. Not on its own. Investigators also spent serious time looking beyond the family entirely. JonBenét had participated in children's beauty pageants, and detectives explored whether that exposure had put her in contact with someone dangerous. Former employees, neighbors, contractors who had worked on the house, people in the pageant world. Hundreds of people were looked at. Leads came in from across the country. Most went nowhere. And then there were the confessions. Over the years, several people either confessed to killing JonBenét or were accused by others. Every single time, investigators compared those claims against the evidence. Every single time, something fell apart. Some confessors knew only what had already been reported publicly, nothing that proved they were actually there. Others were excluded by DNA. Others simply couldn't reconcile their accounts with established facts. The most dramatic example came nearly a decade after JonBenét's death, when a schoolteacher living overseas announced to the world that he was responsible for her murder. It was international news overnight. For a moment, a brief, strange moment, people genuinely thought it might be over. DNA said no. His account didn't match the medical findings. Investigators concluded he wasn't credible. The case went back to exactly where it had always been. Here's what I keep thinking about when I sit with everything this investigation produced. It wasn't a case without evidence. It was almost the opposite. Photographs, fibers, handwriting samples, DNA, footwear impressions, behavioral analysis, medical examinations, hundreds of witness interviews. There was so much evidence, and it pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. Some of it suggested someone who knew that house intimately. Someone comfortable, unhurried, familiar. Some of it suggested a stranger. Someone whose DNA has never been matched to anyone in the investigation. Some of it looked like careful planning. Some of it looked like something that went wrong in the middle of the night. I think we walk into true crime cases, I know I do, with this assumption that enough evidence equals a clear answer. That if the detectives just work hard enough, if the labs run enough tests, if the right person asks the right question, the truth will surface. The JonBenét Ramsey case quietly, persistently dismantles that assumption. Because the evidence was there. A lot of it. And after nearly 30 years, some of the best forensic minds in the country have looked at all of it. And the case is still open. What does that tell us? It tells us that evidence doesn't speak for itself. People interpret it. And when those interpretations fracture in the very first hours of an investigation, when the scene is compromised before anyone even knows a crime has been committed, you might spend the next 3 decades chasing a truth that keeps shifting just out of reach. That's not a comfortable thought, but I think it might be the most honest thing you can say about this case. Nearly 30 years. Let that sink in for a second. JonBenét Ramsey was murdered in 1996. There are people watching this video right now who weren't even born yet, and we still don't know who did it. Not because nobody looked, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because of a question that has quietly haunted this case from the very first morning. And honestly, I think it's the question this entire series has been building toward. Was the greatest mystery figuring out who killed JonBenét? Or was the greatest mystery the investigation itself? Let's talk about where things actually stand, because I want to be honest with you about what the last few decades have and haven't produced. In 2003, forensic scientists managed to extract a DNA profile from biological material on JonBenét's clothing. And this felt, for a lot of people, like the moment everything was about to change. The profile didn't match John Ramsey. It didn't match Patsy. It didn't match Burke. It matched nobody in the family. And if that DNA belonged to the person who killed her, if it came from the person, then this case wasn't what a lot of people had spent years assuming it was. It pointed somewhere else entirely, to someone unknown, someone who has never been identified. But here's where it gets complicated. And I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, because it does. The sample was small. Experts disagreed, genuinely disagreed, about what it represented. Because modern research has shown us something uncomfortable: DNA transfers. Microscopic biological material moves during manufacturing, during packaging, during shipping, during ordinary handling. The presence of someone's DNA on a piece of clothing doesn't automatically place them at a crime. It doesn't automatically mean anything. So, instead of closing the door, the DNA opened about 5 more. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey made an announcement that became national news overnight. Based on the DNA evidence, she said, the Ramsey family should no longer be considered under suspicion. For John Ramsey, who by this point had already lost his wife Patsy to cancer in 2006, who had spent over a decade living under the weight of public suspicion while grieving his daughter, that statement meant something real, something human. After years of being looked at, whispered about, accused and reaccused in the court of public opinion, someone in an official position was finally saying, not them. But not everyone was satisfied. Several investigators who had worked the case pushed back. They argued that one piece of DNA evidence, however significant, wasn't enough to wipe away everything else collected inside that house. Later, the DA's office clarified that the case remained open, that no one had been conclusively identified or eliminated. So even that moment of apparent resolution wasn't really resolution. And then there was John Marcar. If you followed this case at all, you know this chapter. But if you don't, buckle up, because this is one of the strangest detours in the entire story. In 2006, a schoolteacher living overseas confessed to killing JonBenét Ramsey. International headlines. Immediate arrest. News networks going wall to wall. For a brief, disorienting moment, the world genuinely thought it was over. That after a decade of dead ends, someone had finally stepped forward with the truth. Within days, it collapsed completely. His DNA didn't match. His timeline didn't hold up. The details he provided contradicted the physical evidence in ways that couldn't be explained away. He wasn't there. He couldn't have been. And I think about what that moment must have felt like for John Ramsey, for Burke, for everyone who loved JonBenét. To have the answer dangled in front of you, to let yourself believe, even briefly, that it might finally be over, and then to watch it fall apart. That's its own kind of cruelty. Here's the part of this story that gives me something close to hope, though. Forensic science has done things in the last decade that would have seemed impossible in 1996. Cases cold for 40, 50 years solved. Families who had given up on ever knowing the truth given answers. Genetic genealogy in particular has quietly revolutionized what's possible. You find DNA, you build a family tree from it. You work backward until you find a name. It has worked in cases far older and far colder than this one. Jon Ramsey has been vocal about this. He has repeatedly publicly called on investigators to apply these newer methods to the evidence that still exists. And investigators have said they continue to review the case as technology develops. The evidence is still out there. The DNA profile is still on file, and the science catching up to it gets more powerful every year. But here's what I keep coming back to. Why can't stop thinking about even now? Go back to the morning of December 26th, 1996. Patsy comes downstairs and finds a note. She calls 911. Friends arrive. Neighbors arrive. People make food and clean surfaces and move through rooms because that's what people do when someone they love is in crisis. They show up. They try to help. Nobody is thinking about chain of custody or trace evidence or the difference between a kidnapping response and a homicide response. They're just people. Terrified, heartbroken people trying to hold each other together. And then John finds his daughter in that basement room, and he picks her up because of course he does. Because he's her father. Because every instinct a parent has is screaming at him in that moment. Every single thing that compromised that crime scene came from a completely human place. Nobody was being calculating. Nobody was covering anything up in those moments. People were just reacting the way any of us would react to something unimaginable. And in doing so, they may have obscured the only clear path to the truth that ever existed. That is the tragedy inside the tragedy of this case. Crime scenes are fragile in a way that I don't think most people fully appreciate until they look at a case like this one. They capture a single moment in time. Every fiber, every footprint, every fingerprint, every microscopic trace, it's all a frozen record of what happened. But the second people start moving through that space, that record starts changing. And you can never fully separate what was there because of the crime from what ended up there, because of everything that came after. Investigators have spent 30 years trying to make that separation, and they haven't been able to. Not completely. So, where does that leave us? Two theories. Neither of them fully explains everything. The intruder theory asks you to believe that someone entered that house, navigated its layout in the dark, spent enough time to write a 300-word ransom note on paper they found inside the house, killed a 6-year-old girl, and then left without collecting a single dollar, without ever making contact, without ever being identified. But it has that DNA, unidentified, unmatched, still unexplained. The theory that someone inside the home was responsible asks you to square that with the fact that no family member has ever been definitively connected to the murder through forensic evidence. That the DNA exists. That after 30 years of scrutiny, and there has been enormous scrutiny, no charge has ever been filed. Neither theory ties everything together cleanly. Both leave threads dangling. And I think that's the thing about this case that gets under people's skin in a way that most true crime stories don't. We're wired to need resolution. We want the ending where the pieces click into place and justice is served and the story closes. This case doesn't give you that. It never has. What it gives you instead is a little girl named JonBenét. Not the pageant photographs. Not the headlines. Not the cultural phenomenon she became without ever choosing to. A 6-year-old who loved school, who was funny and affectionate and full of energy, who fell asleep in the car on the way home from a Christmas party and was carried to bed by her dad and never woke up. She deserved better than what happened to her that night. She deserved better than what happened to her case in the hours that followed. And she deserves better than being remembered primarily as an unsolved mystery. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this series, beyond the evidence, beyond the theories, beyond all of it, it's that JonBenét Ramsey was a real child, with a real life. cut impossibly short, and somewhere, the complete truth about what happened to her still exists. Maybe in evidence already collected. Maybe in a DNA match waiting to be made. Maybe in a detail nobody has looked at quite the right way yet. Until that day comes, the least we can do is remember her correctly. Not as a case, not as a mystery, as a kid who deserved to grow up. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries that separate fact from fiction, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories every week.